Okay, good evening, everyone. It's very exciting to be here with you tonight. My name's Kim Dunphy and I'm a dance movement therapist and also one of the team of CAMTRU, a researcher and teacher, and part of the crew who are both bringing the presentation tonight, but also a little bit later on you'll hear from us about the beginning of our master's program, which will it's just about to be launched. So I begin by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, the people of the Kulin Nation, the Boonwurrung people. I pay respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge future generations of leaders, and that we are meeting on land that has not been ceded. And I take great pleasure in introducing my colleague, Professor Sabine Koch from Heidelberg and Bonn, Alanus Bonn in Germany. So she has two jobs. So she manages two activities in her role in Germany, both a teaching role at SRH Heidelberg Hochschule and also a research role at the RIA Institute in Alanus Bonn. And I had great pleasure to visit Sabine last year and get a little bit of an idea of the whiz that she is, managing all of that, and then getting an idea of her research in more detail. So why it's a great privilege to have Sabine here with us is she's one of the world's most prolific and acknowledged dance movement therapy researchers, and probably the most. And she has a very wide range of topics in research. And one day I was asking her about this because often we might specialize in research. And Sabine, we brainstormed together, Sabine did, we had a page. And in the top right-hand corner of the page, she listed all the dance movement therapy researchers in the world, all those people whose jobs it is, paid jobs to do dance therapy research. And we came up with 10. So she said, that's why I have to do everything. I have to cover all of the topics because we can't specialize in our field because as yet we don't have enough people across the field to specialize. So that's why she has such a breadth of expertise, from everything from capoeira is her latest research interest, tango for Parkinson's. Most recently, just about to be published, is a fantastic meta-analysis of outcomes of dance movement therapy, which is a very, very important paper for our field. And then this topic she's going to be speaking on tonight, active factors or working factors or causal mechanisms, a range of ways of thinking about that idea. But what are the things that activate change in our clients in creative arts therapies? And this particular topic is, and why Sabine is presenting it here tonight, because it's about all of the creative arts therapies and what is it common amongst those that distinguishes us from other types of therapy, but also bring us together. So without further ado, I introduce Professor Sabine Koch.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to speak here today. I have never been to Australia before. It's my very first time here. And I find it quite exciting to speak in a movie theater with all these guests present. And at the same time, Kim enabled a Zoom session so that other guests in Europe can also join us and around the world and listen to this Zoom session. So thank you very much for that, Kim. I'm feeling very honored and I'm happy to present on my research today. There's going to be a little bit of that outcome research at the beginning of the presentation if you're interested in the effects of dance movement therapy. And then I'm switching over to the active factors of the creative arts therapies to address all of our beautiful modalities. So, before we start, I actually wanted to ask you how many of you are actually working in dance movement therapy here? That's 4 people. Very cool. How many are working in creative arts therapies here? Ooh, that's a lot more. I guess there are also a couple of music therapists among those, right? Art therapists? Ooh, wonderful. Drama therapists? Ooh, yes. Other creative arts therapists? Okay, the music therapists were the majority, but it's really nice to have all of the modalities here. And then there are people from the arts. And we are also hosted by the arts building tonight, which is really nice. I see the new head of the dance department over there. So really great. If you think a moment about what you really think makes your modality work in the arts therapies, what is it really that works in our field? I mean, it may be the therapeutic relation, which is really important in all of our therapies, of course, but it may also be some other thing connected to your modality. So if you think about what really works, what is it that really carries the effects of the change that we bring about? Maybe just one or two ideas emerge, and I would just like you to maybe just share. If you have a concrete idea about what works in our modalities, just share what you think about right now. Anybody?
Connection and presence.
Connection and presence, thank you very much.
Creativity.
Creativity, very big one.
For me, it's like about witnessing in the way a parent will witness a child.
Absolutely, so that the patient feels really seen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, that's a big one too. Yeah, good, thank you. Just a couple of more ideas?
Expression.
Expression is a very important one, the nonverbal way of expressing things that maybe not, we cannot talk about yet. Mm-hmm. So symbolic expression also. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for those ideas. That's what it's going to be about, yes. So let's start. Yes. Okay, just starting with a quote from my mentor, Sherry Goodell at Drexel University. Art and science are two sides of the same coin. Art is a passion pursued with discipline, and science is a discipline pursued with passion. I like that one. And there's, of course, the grand joy that we can find in our modalities, as symbolized here by all these beautiful pictures of children making music together or immersing in art activities or in dance and movement activities. Also those who may be less fortunate, and our work with those patients bring us to think about, particularly because of the pressures of the healthcare system, bring us to think about evidence-based research and efficacy that we need to show in order to be part of that healthcare system, because the healthcare system is asking us to be an evidence-based modality. So we need to do efficacy research on the one side, and that's point A here. And we need to do also what's really getting us further. We need to think about therapeutic factors, which is opposed to the efficacy studies that just merely tell us, does it work? It's really about how does it work? So it's gonna get more juicy if we go into that kind of research that we're gonna hear about today. But the efficacy research is important, and so we have to do these randomized control trials, clinical control trials, in order to show that the modalities are effective and are working. And that we do with group comparisons. And then we can show, for example, that dance therapy reduces depression. And then if we go into the mechanistic studies and ask us, how is that done? What carries that effect? We need mediation analysis to look at that, a correlational technique. And then we can show how the intervention actually works. For example, depression is reduced via the use of light movement or via the use of experienced playfulness, and that helps us, of course, to gear our interventions more towards directly addressing the goal of the patient and the goal of the therapy session. So on the one hand, we have the efficacy studies, outcome studies, and on the other hand, we have what's called mechanistic studies, a little bit of a misleading term, because mechanistic sounds like cause-effect mechanism, which it is in the end, but it's really about therapeutic factors and discovering the factors that carry the effects of the change that we bring about in our modalities. So let me first briefly report on efficacy studies, and I'm focusing on dance therapy here, and then I will switch over to common factors, or the factors overarching the arts therapy. So how does it work actually? So is there evidence base for saying that dance movement therapy is effective? We've been looking into what's called here the evidence-based hierarchy, the levels of evidence. So we've been conducting meta-analysis lately, 2 meta-analyses on the effects of dance therapies. This is when you actually take in all the studies, the good, really broad quantitative studies, randomized controlled trials, clinical controlled trials, and you calculate an overarching effect size for all of those studies, and you look at that, then you can somehow synergize this effects. And there have been many meta-analyses in music therapy, and this is only the state by 2016. So music therapy is by far leading in the field of evidence-based research. And art therapy had 4 then. Dance therapy was catching up in those years up to 2016 with 5 meta-analyses, and drama therapy is now coming this year with 3 meta-analyses. So drama therapy is also catching up greatly, and this is really good news because we're all working on an more and more increasing higher academic level in the terms of evidence-based research. So these are the meta-analysis in dance movement therapy. I just put them together for you, and you can see that there's a couple of people who are doing this. Amongst them is the group, and music therapists help us do them. You can see that Joki Brad and Cherry DeLeo are actually on the team with Cherry Goodell and Minyoung Shim, and have been really teaching our best students here to do meta-analysis, which is wonderful. So it's always good to go together and try and share the competencies. And then there's the group around Vicky Kaku and Bonnie Meekums in the UK who are really doing great work on meta-analysis as well. So what can we say? There's converging evidence for the effectiveness or the efficacy of dance movement therapy for the following patient populations. It's schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. It works for stress reduction. It works for eating disorder, autism, children and youth at risk, and somatoform disorder, for oncology, cystic fibrosis, for chronic pain, Parkinson's disease, dementia, and also additionally in the new meta-analysis for chronic heart failure and for cardiovascular diseases. So there's evidence for all of the, for positive effects of dance therapy on all of these populations. Really exciting. This is 15 different populations now. And what outcomes does it work on? So it mostly works on increasing quality of life of those patients. And it also works greatly on reducing depression and reducing anxiety in those patients. These are all the effect sizes in numbers. What you really need to only know is that it's medium effect sizes. So they're ranging between 0.30 and 0.44, which is a bit lower than the music therapy effect sizes actually, but they're very consistent and stable. So we know that it's there. There is this effect if we compute it over all of the good studies that we have in the field. And now we have computed an update of that meta-analysis just now. It's going to appear, I would say, in 2 or 3 weeks in Frontiers in Psychology. And the exciting thing is that the number of studies has grown so much. So we had 23 studies in the 20 years of the last meta-analysis that we had in the last meta-analysis. And within the last 6 years, we found 41 studies just in 6 years as compared to. So that's a factor of more than 0.6 of increase, more than 6 times as many studies in these late recent 6 years than there were before. So this is very exciting. And we've been looking at the effects not only of dance movement therapy, but also on dance interventions. So there's a couple of studies on dance interventions in there too. So let me just sum up briefly the first efficacy part. The take-home message may be that just one single good empirical study can already help an entire field or an entire population to profit from arts therapies. We found that with the oncology meta-analysis of the group around Sherry Gooder and Joki Brett, that it allowed us to be integrated into the guidelines of the German treatment system. So now there's a recommendation that arts therapies should be integrated in all of the oncology treatment programs. And even though this meta-analysis just said that there was no conclusive effect yet, just the mere existence of that meta-analysis helped us to get into those guidelines. And so it's having a really good effect on the clinical practice, even though we're still working on really showing these effects. And also the collaboration with other arts therapies is so important. We find that all the time. Just let me go back. Oh, it's not going back. Sorry. So we find that all the time, if we go together, that we achieve a lot more, not only in the political sense of, you know, the healthcare policies, where it's really good to be a bigger group and be going together across the arts therapies, but also because we have so much in common. And this is the next part that I'm focusing on. What do we have in common? Do we have common active factors across the arts modalities? So how do the creative arts therapies work? What are the mediating mechanisms of the arts therapies? Can you all understand me well? Yes. Okay, good. So there was a review of Archer and colleagues, a systematic review in 2015 that found that major creative arts therapies, art therapy, music therapy, dance movement therapy, reduce anxiety in palliative care patients. So which active factors common to all arts therapies can carry this effect? So that made me think about really what are those factors that are active across our modalities. And we came up with a suggestion. The aesthetic experience may be a factor that is particular to our field, because other psychotherapies don't work with the aesthetic experience as anything that is assumed to be effective in their modality. So a psychoanalyst or I don't know, a Gestalt therapist wouldn't immediately say it's the aesthetic experience. So we thought maybe it's a good idea to define the aesthetic experience and to look at the aesthetic experience of the patients as a potential mediator of this relation between what we do in arts therapies over here and what's resulting the decrease of anxiety in palliative care, for example. And we've operationalized the aesthetic experience with these elements. So there's experience beauty, of course, of something I'm doing in the arts therapies. There's the experience symbolism, somebody mentioned that already. There's the experience being touched or being moved by something. There is the experience agency. I'm actually authentically expressing myself, and I'm encouraged to authentically express myself. I'm seen, to be seen. I'm experiencing a particular kind of body-mind connection. I'm experiencing a safe space, a sheltered space where I can actually try out things. And I'm experiencing closure and integrity. And all of that is part of what we put into the construct of the aesthetic experience. And measured that as a mediator with a simple questionnaire. And we also looked at moderators. Of course, there are other variables of influence, such as culture of the person, gender of the person, age of the person, that may also additionally influence the result. So this is a model. And this is also how we research this with mediation analysis, looking at correlational relations between these variables. And I will later on with an empirical study explain to you how the findings are interpreted, basically. So we talk about common factors of all psychotherapy. That's what psychotherapy research is looking at. We talk about here on the medium level of factors of all creative arts therapies. And then there's, of course, also specific factors that are specific to the single arts therapies modality: dance therapy, drama therapy, music therapy, art therapy. And for all these common factors, Bruce Wambold and Michael Lambert have done some very good research about that. And they are actually showing that our specific techniques, music therapy, drama therapy, dance therapy, art therapy, are not that important. They only explain about 15% of the actual variance of the outcome variables later on, of the actual change that happens in the therapy. Here in this study by Norcross, even only 8% are explained by the actual treatment modality. And in a study by Wambold, it's coming down to 1% that the actual treatment method is explaining. So actually the modality is not all that important. The expectancy effects are as important as the modality. So if I really believe that this helps me if I go into music therapy, call it placebo effect, it's also discussed under that label, but the belief per se is also explaining the better outcome or the change in the therapy. So it's really important for us as therapists, no matter what modality we do treat the patient with, to increase the expectancies and to also believe in our modality, because our belief, of course, transmits to the client as well. So it's just as important as your modality per se. And then there's the client life. And of course, the client life, if you find a new job, lose your job, find a new partner, lose your partner, that explains a whole lot of whether you get better or whether you get worse, right? So we are not all that important in the therapy. So that just reflects how important life is. And then the common factors. And these common factors are really interesting. That's why I also have another slide for you on that. Because they are valid for all of the psychotherapies, basically. And let's just move to that. Yes. So, oh, you don't see that. Yeah. So the most important common factor is the therapeutic relation. So really entering into the therapeutic relation with your patient, and then activate the resources of your patient, find out what the strengths of your patients are, support the strengths of your patients, and then move into the sensory really with the patients, which we are all really doing good in creative arts therapies because our modalities are sensory modalities. That's called problem actualization. So you really want to bring the patient into the sensory experience of the problem in order to then go from there to solve it. And then the motivational clarification, so creating insight in the mechanisms for the patient, and the solution orientation and the practicing and the behavioral change for the everyday life. So this is what the common factors are about, research by Grave in Germany and by Wambold and Lambert in the States. I have 3 examples of mediating effects that we found in dance movement therapy, and then I will move over to one study that we did across the arts therapies. So the first is that therapeutic mirroring is a major factor of change when you do dance movement therapy with autistic children and autistic adults, and in increasing the interaction of autistic children or autistic adults. So therapeutic mirroring, we can do in all of the modalities. We do it in movement, we can do it in music, we can do it in art, we can do it in drama. And it's one of the major factors that changes, that brings about change in autistic populations. So here's what else it changes. It brings about change in body awareness of the autistic adults in this case. It brings about better social competencies, better well-being, particularly the decrease of anxiety again, and better perception of the borders between myself as a person and the other that I'm interacting with. So that was a study we did in 2015. And then I'm moving to the active factors across arts therapies from here. So this is probably my most important slide for this evening. It defines 5 clusters of active factors that went through processes and stages with me. So first of all, I wrote down 10 for dance movement therapy, and then I looked across, and then I read all these philosophical writers, and then I went back and using basically experience and philosophical writing and our knowledge in the field, I clustered them into 5 clusters. So there's room for change here, and maybe you may not agree, or maybe you're missing one. Then it would be really interesting for me to know about that later on in the discussion.
Can we get a copy of these slides, or should we be writing them?
I could send in the slides to put them on the web page to Kim. Yeah, happy to do that. So the first one I called hedonism, and here's the first problem, because I discussed with Kim and she said, you know what, hedonism sounds a little egocentric, so in the direction of egocentric, right? That was like, and it may not be what you really mean. So what I really mean is art for pleasure and play. It's the non-goal directed free space that you want to immerse in and just be playful. The way when the visitors come to our music room E9 in Heidelberg and they see all these instruments, can we play? Yes, that's what I mean. I mean, it's pleasure and play that is stimulated by all of our modalities. So maybe I may be calling it play space. Play space is really something I like very much, instead of hedonism. So it's about, you know, being there in the present moment, the sensual experience I'm immersing in, and the pleasure of that. Then the next one I called aesthetics. It's art for beauty, but beauty not only in the sense of beauty, but also in the sense of really authentic expression. So if I express my anger, for example, it can be really beautiful, or it can be really aesthetic, let's say, because it's my expression and finds a channel, and you know, it's out there. So it's really about both. I mean, the beautiful and the authentic expression together. And that creates, of course, this being touched and being moved that was already mentioned before. This is actually something that is really getting a lot of research attention lately, the being moved as a feeling and the being moved as a concept. And I have a couple of slides, and if we have time, I'll show them. And then the symbol. So the symbolic meaning that comes out of the nonverbal. It's nonverbal meaning making in our modality, with music, with art, with movement, for the purpose of symbolizing something and being communicated to something, for the purpose of being seen by somebody. And that's that. And then the inactive transitional space. So the transitional space applies to all psychotherapy because it's that protected space where you have time to adjust to changes or to do changes. But in our modality, we are all active modalities. So we give the clients some possibility for enactment of the change that is actually happening and work with that actively. For example, in drama therapy with the as if space, you know, I create an as if space and I can be anything, and I can take a role and distance from the problem and look at it from different sides. So that's the inactive transitional space, relational testing, reality testing, that all happens in that protected, sheltered environment that helps us build resilience and that's from our resources and helps us transform and helps us to master and to put closure on certain things. And then the last factor I call generativity. This is really about feeling productive. So feeling productive, feeling in control, feeling in the flow, feeling self-efficacy, my own self-efficacy, feeling empowered. And also because we were thinking writing that proposal for the palliative care, also art for leaving something behind, leaving traces behind, putting closure on things, putting completion and integrity on things. So these are the factors, and they are also really inspired by some of those readings. And I just wanted to point out Gadamer, who is the philosopher in Heidelberg, because he has been writing a small but really significant book on the power of aesthetics in 1977. And he talks about 3 active factors. The first one, he talks about play, he talks about symbol, and he talks about feast. So to come together and celebrate together, that's also one of the active factors of the aesthetic realm. And I like that a lot. And maybe you could put it to the play space here. So, good. Anything missing there? Okay, good. Well, hope there's probably something missing, but not so obvious that you need to shout it out. Okay. And then I looked into theory because I became aware increasingly that a couple of people have been writing about active factors, and everybody comes up with their own active factors. And when I count them all together in the art therapy fields, there's about 100 active factors that I can count. So it's really more useful for research is to have a theory model where I can actually put these active factors in and categorize them. And then I looked into theory models of aesthetic experience, and in the entire cognitive science, there were only models that were looking at the receptive side of aesthetics. So they were all perceptive models. There was not one model that took into account that there's some active, creative activity that can actually also cause aesthetic experience or whatever. So it was totally missing out. And that's why I decided to enlarge this model that I found from Leda, and just on top of our model of embodied affectivity of Thomas Fuchs and me, I put the active side to it. So we have this model now, put out this model in 2017, that really doesn't only account for the receptive side of the aesthetic experience, but also it accounts for the active side of the expression, coming from the person into, some kind of art object or art product. This is more obvious in visual art than in dance movement, for example. And then the impression side, the receptive side, what that art does with the person, or modalities taken in receptive approaches. So both sides are actually represented in that model. And it really gives us a way to plug in most of the working factors or the active factors that we've been talking about now into the active side of the model, into the art making side, aesthetic action side, emotion side, or moving side, as opposed to the being affected side, being moved side, aesthetic perception side. So there are also a couple of active factors up there, of course, but this is the new theoretical component down here. So putting the active factors in here, you can say I experience beauty, I experience body-mind unity, which is an important one in dance movement therapy. But I have that as if space in order to do test acting. I can do enactments, I can do creations, I can go into that symbolic space, doing rituals, using metaphors in order to express myself, in order to be seen. I'm using play, I'm using creativity, non-goal oriented communication and activation, but also imagination, which we could put to the active as well as the receptive side, and emergence of meaning back from the art. So a couple of more empirical results towards that. We've been starting to empirically investigate on the basis of this model a couple of factors. For example, in movement therapy, we use movement qualities and look at their effects. So here we have been giving instructions to a group of people to either move in strong or to move in light qualities. It was a between group design, so different groups of people. And then from there, we have been finding that people who moved in light qualities showed more positive affect, and people who moved in light qualities also showed more memories of positive life events than people moving in strong movement qualities, where they remembered more negative life events and also showed more negative affect afterwards. We did a study that I called the Joy Dance study, where we applied a dance from Israel, just a circle dance, with a lot of vertical movements, jumping movements, bouncing movements. We did that with depressed patients, and we were actually able in 2 studies in a row to show that the actual bouncing movement was carrying the effect of the decrease of depressed affect and the increase in vitality and positive affect that the patients experienced. And then we did a 3rd study on the working of dance movement therapy, where we looked at the non-goal orientation component. In dance, dance is a non-goal oriented activity. It's not like you're picking up the bottle of water and opening it because you feel thirsty and then you're drinking. That was good. But it's just you're standing there and you're moving to the music without any particular purpose, just for the pleasure of it, basically, right? So we compared 2 groups, a group that just moved to the music and a group that had the same music on, but they had to somehow, they had to walk around in a big circle, and there were chairs in the room, and there were forms on the chairs, and they had to pick up papers and had to put them on the correct chair while they were walking around. So that was just task-oriented activity to the same music. And then later on, we looked at a couple of health-relevant outcomes. For example, well-being, stress, and self-efficacy. And we found that the group that just goal-oriented, non-goal-orientedly moved to the music was showing a higher well-being afterwards, a higher decrease of stress, and a higher self-efficacy as compared to the task-oriented group, which was doing just this task to the same music. So that was some of the things we do. And then there's this new factor that I was already talking about, being moved, which is a factor of all of our creative arts modalities, of course. And being moved as part of the aesthetic experience is looked at in a couple of disciplines right now, very interestingly. It was looked at for a while in authentic movement modality and dance movement therapy, but now social psychology is starting research on being moved, and they are actually looking at it and have a concept, developed a concept that they call Kama Muta, which means translated moved by love. And they are finding this being moved concept in more than 17 nations around the world, and comparing the concept and what really cool research, and Calvin Trevassen has been working on it. Winfried Menninghaus from the Aesthetics Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg, in Frankfurt in Germany, he is measuring the being moved as a basic emotion, and he's measuring it looking at goosebump reactions and also teary eyes, and the combination of both, he says, is being moved, is our operationalization. So he's using psychophysiological measurements on that factor. He calls it goose tears. That's why I wrote it. I think it's kind of funny, but yeah. So there have been a lot of people working from different backgrounds on that factor of being moved lately. And it's really interesting to look into that research for us, because it's a major thing that we, of course, do with arts stimuli or art creation. So being moved is at the base of any emotion, at the base of empathy and moral feelings, and connected to aesthetic feelings. And we assume it as one of the active factors of all creative arts therapies. All creative arts therapies, of course, want to create this being moved experience, these significant moments that the patients experience in the therapy, in any of our modalities. So since I only have 5 more minutes, I will keep this short. So this is what we looked at empirically across the arts therapies. Gudrun Lange, master thesis student of mine, did offer all the creative materials from all the arts therapies, and just had people who came in, the participants, create something for 8 minutes in the modality of their choice. And then she measured well-being and self-efficacy. And then she gave them an aesthetic response with her body, mostly in dance. And then she measured their well-being and self-efficacy again. And she also measured what she called the creation factors. She came up with a scale with just 4 items: how free the person felt, how effective the person felt with having an effect on something, how empowered the person felt, and how creative the person felt. And this short creation scale with the 4 items was actually a significant mediator of the active creation. So the active creation significantly influenced well-being and self-efficacy. And when we put in the creation scale with those only 4 items as the mediator, we found that the creation scale would bind so much variance that this was even becoming an insignificant correlation, which we call a full mediation. And it's hard to find those. This is really something that you rarely find, these mediation effects, and a full mediation is very rare. So we had a partial mediation on Wohlbefinden, where there was a lot of variance explained by that short scale, but not so much that this would become totally insignificant, this correlation down here. And then in the self-efficacy, we had a complete mediation where the correlation would even vanish on the direct path and be totally mediated through these 4 items. What do we learn from that? We learn that it's really important also in the clinical settings to ask our patients what their preferences are, to give them choices, to let them immerse in the modality that they feel most confident with or that they actually want to do. If we put them in a place where they have to do art therapy, but they want to do music therapy, then the art therapist may have to work for 8 weeks before they actually feel confident enough and not anxious anymore in order to really go there and profit from it. So it's really important in our clinical settings that we have them have those free choices as much as we can. I don't know about here. In Germany, it's often the way that the medical staff is making the treatment plan and then the patient is put in one group. And in some hospitals, it's different. They can actually choose. And in the psychosomatic hospitals, they can choose more and more. But in the psychiatries, it's more strict often. So they're often put just in one group. And you have to deal with them and they have to deal with you. But that doesn't make a lot of sense. That this research shows us, for example, that that doesn't make a lot of sense. They should be able to choose, because if they feel confident enough to go into that therapy, if they already expect that they will get better, then of course they can profit. And they cannot profit if the anxiety level is so high that they, that they need weeks to get off that anxiety level. Okay, and for the research, what do we learn? We learn that active factor studies are so important also in order to conduct efficacy studies that really make sense. Because if you think about choosing control groups, you have to choose active control groups that you compare with music therapy groups or dance therapy groups. But if we don't know our own working factors, and we hardly know anything about the working factors of the active control groups, how should we really choose a suitable control group? So if we don't know what carries our effects and we don't know what carries the effects of the control group, there's no way to find a suitable control group. So in order for that to make really sense, we need to know much more about the active factors that are in the modalities and in the control group modalities, of course. There's a very unfortunate example from the UK where they compared dance therapy with Pilates and they didn't find an effect, but that was, in my view, exactly because we don't know about the working factors, and so it's very hard to choose control groups that make sense. Okay, so I'm not going to go too deeply into active factors of dance therapy. This is going to be in the slides, and there's going to be all the references in the slides, so you can look that up afterwards. Just a short note on the terminology questions. So I'm talking about active factors. It's also called therapeutic factors. It's also called working factors. It's also called healing factors. It's called mechanisms and therapeutic or clinical mechanisms in more technical terms. So there's a whole list of words that are used in the international realm. In Germany, it's easy. We just say Wirkfaktor and we just have one word, so we know what we're talking about. But in the international realm, it's difficult because there are so many different keywords, and you might not find the right literature if you just put in one of those and not the other. So just that is also important, particularly if you want to do research on it. So take-home message part 2. In the field of creative arts therapies, we're presently investigating how our modalities work, how all of these that I named contribute to healing. And this is investigated with all methods. And that is also very nice, that you can investigate active factors with all methods. You can conduct interviews with experts or with patients and then extract the active factors that they believe in, compare it to efficacy studies that have looked at it or other more experimental studies that are looking at it. So we can even use arts-based research techniques, as my student did in her master's thesis with the aesthetic answering, in order to find out more about active factors, which is really, really nice. We had a really good symposium on active factors in Alanus University last year, and there's this link to a nice presentation that kind of arts-based, taking it up into an artistic form of presentation if you're interested. And this is going to be the conference of this year in September in Heidelberg. It's on active factors in creative arts therapies. So this is the hot topic. You are right in the middle of it. You can still go there, but it's mostly in German, so it's probably not very interesting for most of you. But it's there, we're going to do it. And then there are 2 new developments that I just wanted to let you know about. The first is an open access online journal that we just launched. It's the Journal of Arts Therapies. There's the website, and many nice and great people are on board already, also from here, from this university, in the editorial board. And we are also planning to launch a PhD program, Creative Arts Therapies, in Germany at the University of Alfter, where I work in my research institute, and this is hopefully going to start next year in fall. So if you're interested in any of these things, just get in touch with me. And then to continue the take-home message, our strength is actively working on solutions in creative modalities. That's the strength of all arts therapies. So the investigation of specific active factors in secondary analysis would be great. So we have a lot of data out there that we could easily reanalyze in terms of finding mediation relationships. So we don't need to do empirical studies from the ground. We can just use the data that's there and look at what we can find out. That's really very exciting news, because then we can, do a lot more if we do secondary analysis than if we have to do the entire studies by ourselves. And it's always so important to collaborate with the other arts therapies for making the work really thrive, and with the arts, of course. And then there are, of course, a lot of open questions remaining. Is the aesthetic experience a central therapeutic factor? Is being moved one of its subcomponents? Is the model that I put out helpful at all? How can art be used as a research method in this entire process? And how can we define and differentiate the method of arts-based research better? So we're just getting into that, defining arts-based research. Arts-based research being the use of art as a method to increase knowledge, as a scientific method. And let me just end with a quote by Rudolf Arnheim. He says, particularly in times of art lacking purpose and direction, it is the mission of the arts therapies to take the lead on driving the arts further in the service of humanity. He continues, the arts therapies, should show by example that the arts, in order to sustain their vigor, must serve the needs of humanity. Those needs are more conspicuous in sickness, and equally more conspicuous is the benefit received from the art by sick people. By demonstrating what it can do for the minds of the sick, art makes us remember what it is meant to do for everybody. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Excellent, Sabine. Thank you for very stimulating conversation. Lots of ideas that have been explored and so many more to go. So I'm going to invite colleagues present with us in the room and also those by Zoom who might like to provoke conversation, ask a question of Sabine. Is there anybody who's got something they might like to ask?
I just want to ask if it's possible. You didn't mention the word engagement during this.
Yeah.
And engagement's obviously a big word.
Absolutely.
How much do you think is the responsibility of helping people is just the collectiveness, the engagement, as opposed to the actual modality?
Yeah, I would say the engagement is really what we call the therapeutic relationship. So that's probably what you're talking about when you're talking about engagement, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the big common factor, and it explains the majority of the variance. In the beginning, they thought it was 50% of the variance of the outcome that is explained or the change by it. It's now a little bit smaller, but it's still the most effective active factor, the big one. Absolutely. Thank you for that.
One of the slides you had the word thou. We didn't hear about the thou. Is that in the Buber sense?
Oh, yeah, I guess that was in the Buber sense, because that was also one of the philosophical backgrounds that went into this.
And is that something that needs to be there in the aesthetic experience?
Sure. Also in the therapeutic relation, it's really about the appreciation of the wholeness of what's in each person and the respect for that. That drives the therapeutic relation also. Yes.
I'm going to ask just if you ask a question, just briefly introduce yourself so we have an idea.
Oh, sure. That would be nice.
My name is Camille, and I was curious to ask, as far as the effects are concerned, in terms of the psychological effects, the variables, depression, anxiety looked at, how long-lasting the effect is, number one, and number two, whether you can try to attempt some structural equation modeling approach, sort of a look more comprehensively at a variety of those factors. So, for example, when you are using this variable aesthetic qualities.
Aesthetic experience?
Aesthetic experience. So you listed was quite a number. It seems like it was a compounded variable.
Yeah.
If that is so, whether you have tried to do the confirmatory factor analysis. First, number one. I guess also you mentioned hedonism, and I was wondering whether you tried to look at the opposite of hedonism, which is eudaimonia, which is what we bring into the experience, so that kind of is related to intention itself.
I haven't been looking at the last one, and thanks for these very interesting questions. And there's also some competencies sitting here in terms of statistical analysis I'm hearing.
I mean, the psychometrics, or how psychometrics sound.
Yeah. We have to do more reliability analysis on that aesthetic scale, because I've only tested it with 2 populations and 2 studies so far, so there's not a lot of data on that scale. The other question was the first one?
So those, so hedonism and also structural equation modeling, so have a more.
Yeah. I'm trying to find your very first question.
How long-lasting?
Oh, the long-lasting effects. Yes, thank you very much. It's so hard to keep three inputs in mind. Okay, that's really interesting, because in the meta-analysis that we did by 2014, there was only one study that looked at follow-up, that had a follow-up at all included, and had a good result for the follow-up. It was in stress reduction and the increase in quality of life, and it had remained significant after 6 months. And now in the new meta-analysis, we have 7 studies. So this is really exciting. And all of them are showing that the effects remain stable. In some cases, the effects increased from the outcome from the first post measure, even increased in the follow-up measure. And there was only one study where it dropped below significance. So it looks like there's a really good, and this was 22 weeks on average after the interventions. So from these 7 studies, it looks like there's a really good carryover effect to last even after the discontinuation of the therapy. Very important question, and
we need people with this kind of capacity to come and do research in creative arts therapies. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Fred Zerfus, an IT scientist. My question is dose response. Is there any indication of that? And the second is, what sort of cooperation, coordination you're getting with the medical profession?
So the dose response, that is just something we are also getting into. How much of the interventions do people need in order to become optimally better? There's not a lot of knowledge on that, and with my colleague Katrin Seifert, who by coincidence is here this week in Melbourne, which is sort of interesting, we are doing a dose analysis across the arts therapies at the moment in order to look at that, and also for our meta-analysis we have data on that that's pretty extensive right now, so it just needs to be analyzed. It's very new also to look at that topic in our field. And music therapy has been doing that. I know that they've been doing that. So they are always a little more advanced than the other therapies. And the second question was?
About the medical profession.
Oh, yes. And that's interesting too, because there's a lot of interest in embodiment research lately from the medical profession. So they're really getting interested in embodiment research, which is interdisciplinary. And basically looking at that body-mind connection in a more integrated way than we did it before, in a more interdisciplinary way, also in a more integrated way. For example, in my discipline, psychology, coming from psychology, we did a lot of nonverbal communication research all the time, and that was just analyzing and pulling apart what does it mean if you pull up the right eyebrow and stuff like that. That becomes meaningless at a certain point. And now embodiment research is keeping the effects of our bodily presence together and looking at the effects that has. And the medical profession is becoming increasingly interested in that kind of research, and also in how to apply this then for the patients, well, in terms of body psychotherapies, in terms of movement therapies, in terms of dance therapy. So there's an increasing interest.
Okay, we've got last question, Carol.
Hi, I'm Carol Brown, Professor of Dance. I'm just curious about this concept of beauty in relation to aesthetic beauty, and whether you use the term affect in relation to that, because it strikes me that it's a term that has a particular legacy, and it's a culturally relative term as well. So maybe you could speak a little bit to that concept of beauty, that you mean being moved by beauty, how that's defined.
So that being moved concept, actually, you're talking about when you say affect and beauty and the relation, is that what you're referring to?
Well, it's that you use the word, you're defining aesthetics by beauty.
Experience beauty as one component of aesthetics, yes.
One component, but that was the sort of dominant in terms of aesthetics and how we define aesthetics. For beauty, it has a particular legacy in relation to classicism and idealism and certainly femininity and a whole lot of things that come with that word beauty. I just sort of wanted to unpack that as a term.
We haven't unpacked it. We are just giving this questionnaire to the participants and say, on a scale from 1 to, or from 0 to 10, how much beauty did you experience? So it's up to their definition, basically. And I was just having this discussion with Kim on Monday about the high arts, because that's also connected to that understanding of beauty, right? And that the Max Planck Institute for Aesthetics Research in Frankfurt, for example, that there's a woman there, she's a musician, and she's particularly placing emphasis on art being high art. And I said, we can't really relate to them right now, because we need to work with what the patient brings to us. And if the patient thinks, Helene Fischer, which is a German folk singer, is great, then we work with that music, because that's meaningful for the patient. And so it's, just that we really look what's meaningful for the patient, what brings out the emotion in the patient, and then we work with that kind of art. And that's no use for us to talk about, I guess.
All right, let's have just one last one, and then we've got to close our session.
My name is Sylvia. I'm just doing a master's in experiential therapy. And I was wondering about if you work with neuroscience and the polyvagal theory and all that stuff, because that's probably the connection point now for the medical profession, because I can't ignore that.
Yeah, we work with that when we do the body psychotherapy, also in our master studies, of course. And I need to go much deeper into that because I think I still have to catch up.
So we've learned a lot from you, Sabina, and we've also learned all that's still ahead. So lots of ideas there. So we encourage those amongst you who might like to take any of this forward to come and talk to us here at CAMTRU. On that note, I'm going to finish with Sabina, and thank you so much for coming all the way to Australia to share your wonderful work with us tonight. So thank you, Sabina.